Hello, everybody. In this video, I want to walk you through what is perhaps the core research method in the social sciences, interviews. We'll cover four broad areas. First, we'll talk about why interviews matter. Then we'll talk about how to plan interviews carefully. Third, how we actually conduct those interviews we planned. And then finally, we'll briefly touch on how to analyze that, or at least set up what you've done so you can analyze it once you've collected it. So first, why interviews? At their core, interviews may be the method of the social sciences. It may be the core method of all philosophy as well. We engage in conversation and learn about our social worlds through those conversations. Long before we had surveys, sensors, logs, large-scale data sets, we had people talking to each other in order to understand how the world looked through those other people's eyes, or in order to work through a problem together, right? To interview is fundamentally to engage in a structured information seeking through conversation. This practice appears in lots of different domains: journalism, a journalistic interview, policing and crime solving, medicine, when you're trying to diagnose someone, hiring and evaluation is probably the interview situation most of you are most familiar with, oral histories, and of course, what we're doing here, the kind of social scientific research. What distinguishes interviews in the research context is not simply that we talk to people, but that we do so systematically and with analytic intent. We want to answer questions more broadly, and so we are using that interview in order to dig up the kinds of answers we need to the questions we have. Now, when you read the literature, you'll see very often, in fact, more often than in any other kind of phrasing here, that the authors engaged in a semi-structured interview process, which makes you obviously very quickly come to the question of, well, okay, that if there is such a thing as semi-structured interviews, there must also be structured interviews and unstructured interviews. And there are, but to be fair, it's almost redundant. I mean, the vast majority lay between these two poles. And so what are those poles? At one end, we have a structured interview, and that is essentially surveys in oral form. If you've ever had someone walk up to you with a clipboard and say, "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Well, they're probably trying to sell you something. But if they aren't doing that, they are probably engaging in a survey, but it is a survey where they want the person to be asking you those questions. Getting people to answer surveys in written form or online is extraordinarily difficult, or on the phone, even more difficult. But honestly, the easiest way to actually get the response, if you can get them to start to respond, to finish the survey, is to do it in person. So that's a structured interview. It's basically a verbal, either over the phone or in person or online, a verbal survey. So that's the most structured form. Everybody gets exactly the same questions in exactly the same order. And although they might be open-ended, surveys can certainly have open-ended questions, in many cases they'll literally ask you, would you say that you feel very strongly about this toothpaste brand or not at all strongly? They may actually ask you for scales and that sort of thing. So that is a very structured interview. An unstructured interview is a conversation. So an unstructured interview, I mean, in the most very extreme case of this, it's one in which topics may drift from place to place, where you're just trying to get to know someone, where there's no intent behind your conversation. I don't think I've ever been in an unstructured interview, right? I don't think I've ever been in an unstructured conversation. If you're getting together to just chat, there's usually some subcontext there. You're probably trying to find something out, or you're trying to impress the person or persuade the person in some way. So there probably isn't a completely unstructured interview, but you have these semi-structured interviews, which include some questions, some formal content. If you're interviewing multiple people, they may get some of the same questions. You're certainly intending to get answers to a particular set of problems or questions, but you also have left room for asking follow-ups, for following kind of pathways that you did not expect, for various ways in which respondents might want to ask questions back, although you really need to try to limit that, or where the respondents may want to try to create their own structure in which they're explaining their worldview, right? And so it allows for a lot more context and a lot more texture. It allows you to be much more exploratory, which is frankly where I and most people I know use interviews. That is when they're trying to explore a new area. And so it gives you that kind of chance for discovery. The downside of this is you can have just about anyone do a structured interview where they have to follow things in a prescribed pattern, and basically they have to be reasonably friendly so people will answer their questions, but there's no real skill involved in that. A good interviewer is hard to find, right? A good interviewer not only has to plan ahead and have a fairly good command of what they want to get out of the interview, and in many cases who they're talking to in the context of that. But they have to be fast on their feet. They have to be a really good listener. They have to put the interviewee at ease, and they have to make sure that they can kind of mirror or blend into the background a bit, but at the same time elicit responses. So that's actually a developed skill set. Now, I will say, if interviewing is going to be a part of your practices, and it probably will be, the only way you really develop that is by practicing it. And so I don't want to say this to discourage the use of interviewing, just to note that the difficulty of this is that it is a more skilled process, and that you have the danger, if the person doing the interviewing is not skilled, that you may introduce some of the more common biases. It's very easy in interviews to introduce some of these biases. In particular, we might look at something like observer bias, where the interviewer's own expectations tend to shape that interaction, their own expectations around or even stereotypes around the people they're talking to. They may drive their own solution to the problem and not be open to what they're actually hearing. So you have this kind of strong observer bias as a problem kind of across different methods, but it tends to really rear its head in this context. And the other side of this is something like a Hawthorne effect, which we may talk about later, which is people may respond differently just because you're there and asking questions, right? Your attention alone may change the way they are thinking about their interaction with their environment. Or something like a social desirability effect, where they may be answering your questions in such a way that they want to make their own views sound more socially acceptable or desirable. So, they have this standard, this is where they get to tell their story. And so as part of their presentation to you of themselves, they may not be giving you the most accurate view either of what they're observing or of their own self, their own internal observations. They may not be giving you their unbiased view of what they actually think because they want to look good in front of the interviewer. So those are the problems, but I think that in most cases, if you can mitigate against those a bit, it's a useful way of engaging in initial exploration. What kinds of questions do we want to answer with an interview? And yes, part of it is just what's going on here. It's an exploratory process. I'll often use interviews on the back end as well, which is I've collected a survey, and you've probably seen these if you've seen a survey, and you may have actually responded to them, which is, if we have other questions, can we contact you afterwards? And especially for open-ended surveys, that's a really good way to kind of say, okay, we have all this data, now we need to start to make sense of it. Can we talk people through and dig a little deeper with a small subset of who we've surveyed? So you can use it on the back end, but generally it's at that exploratory stage where you're still just trying to figure out what's going on. It gives you a feeling for the social world of the person who is responding to you, the language people use, the kinds of boundaries, the kinds of expectations, the kind of relationships, the kinds of internal distinctions people make about the kinds of work they do or the environments in which they work. I'm saying work here just because a lot of times in my own, it's been working with organizations, but there are all kinds of social milieu where you might want to talk about their social life in those interactions, right? Often what you're looking for, this is the problem that we'll see throughout these kinds of interactive investigations, is you have to be very careful about the questions you're asking and the kinds of questions they can answer. So they can answer questions about their own attitudes and their own beliefs, right? This is the standard survey kinds of questions for things like political polling or attitudinal surveys around products or around policies or something like that, right? You can ask someone, what's your attitude towards this? And they can produce it for you. I will say, my personal belief on this is that both in surveys and interviews, in many cases, people don't actually have attitudes towards things right before you ask. And in the moment, even without consciously knowing this, in the moment you ask that question, they've formed an attitude. So it is very difficult not to prime this. It's very difficult not to produce a response on that front. But if you are interested in how people feel about something or how people think through something or how they interact with their own spaces, this is a good way to kind of elicit that from them. With the caveat that A, they may not actually have that until you ask it, and B, honestly, we don't know ourselves as well as we might think. So this is something that you obviously probably have thought about, but people can only respond even when they're intending to respond as honestly as possible, and that's not always the case. But even under those conditions, you may not get the whole story, right? You may get a version of it that people tell themselves. And then the secondary part of this is they can be informants about what's going on, especially, they can tell stories about what's happened in their environment, right? Or what they have observed or what they've seen. And so this is kind of hearsay evidence in some ways, right? Because you're getting it through their lens. So as long as you keep in mind that their own interpretation is part of this, and you try to get this panoptic view where you kind of get a number of people telling the same story and can kind of piece together what that elephant looks like by talking to each of these independent observers, you can get information that way and get a general impressionistic view of the social milieu. But you need to be careful about assuming that that you're actually getting kind of the facts on the ground. These are not direct observations. They involve the person interpreting their own environment and then reinterpreting it for you, and then you reinterpreting that again. And so you've got some layers here between the observable world and what you're getting from an interview. So how do you plan a good interview? And I will note that you plan a good interview. A lot of what makes a good interview is the planning that happens before that. They're not improvised. They're carefully planned artifacts of research design. And I want to emphasize kind of 4 steps in that planning process. First, you need to clarify exactly what it is you're trying to learn. Be as clear as possible about what you're trying to discover. This is a deductive rather than inductive process, but because interviews themselves are so inductive, especially if there's this semi-structured kind of process, you really should come into this with some questions that you want answered. You should have a reason for doing these interviews, not just, I'm interested in this topic, I'm going to go interview some people, right? So be pretty clear about what it is you want to discover. Vagueness is not a virtue in this case. You should be explicit about the concepts you're exploring and about how you expect to summarize, classify, or compare the responses afterwards. You may not know what the answers are going to be, right? You may not even know if you will go in a direction you don't expect, but you should, as you're coming up with questions, start to think a little bit about, okay, what am I going to do with these answers, right? Am I going to do a thematic analysis of this afterwards? If so, can I ask these questions in such a way that they will facilitate that thematic analysis afterwards? So you need to kind of think ahead a little bit about the kinds of things you're going to be getting in, the kinds of overall, a crush of transcribed interviews. What are you going to do with that mass of transcribed interviews afterwards? Because you can think about how you can ask questions that will make that process easier. Interviews tend to be real well suited, as I noted, for understanding people's meanings, their beliefs, their identities, their motivations, their own interpretations of events or environments around them, and a little less, as I said, accurate when it comes to reconstructing factual sequences or information. This is something that people who do criminal investigations, for example, already know. So you need to think a little bit about what it is you're trying to get out of this and whether that's going to be valid, to go back to our earlier discussions of validity, whether this is a valid way of getting at that world. The second step here is to build some kind of interview research document or guide. This is going to be a set of clear, sort of jargon-free, direct is the wrong way to put that, but clear, jargon-free, concise, I guess, questions that map directly onto your research goals. And when you write these questions, you need to think about, these are going to be like your target questions, right? The ones you genuinely need answers to, and you're going to leave the space. You should have an idea for how long each of these interviews will take. You can leave the space for exploring areas within that, but you want to make sure you come back and cover the things that you want to cover in your interviews. And honestly, this has to go to the institutional review board, and they're going to want to see these questions as part of it. This is a common sort of thing for them to see, but they want to know what your guiding questions are going to be. Now, these should be open-ended rather than kind of leading. So you're not kind of testing the respondents. You're not trying to get out of them what your preconceived notion is. You're trying to allow them to open themselves up to you and to articulate their own interpretation. So to that end, yes, no questions or this or that questions tend to end up with yes or no answers and this or that answers. So think about ways you can ask this so that people feel like they can open up and discuss it. Make sure you're using language that doesn't tend to favor a particular response as much as possible. Really think through the questions to make sure that they are not priming particular answers, right? Generally, a general kind of strategy to this is you start out with very broad questions and then go narrower and narrower through the interview. If you have broad questions to start with to kind of orient towards the whatever it is that you're studying, whatever it is you're trying to get out of these folks, you start very broad, and then over time you can narrow, and you can be a little bit, especially if the things you're talking to them about could be sensitive, you can get a little bit towards the more sensitive questions as you get to the end. For a couple of reasons. This is true for surveys as well. Once people are already invested in the process, they're not going to kind of, burn it down because you've asked a question, or shut down because you've asked a question that's a little closer to the bone. The overall here should be, you should listen to Terry Gross or other good interviewers journalistic interviewers for this, because, they don't start with the thing that's most challenging, but they can get to a place where challenging is the wrong word, especially for what we're doing, but the things that are more sensitive, as you've already invested and built up a rapport. So think about that kind of narrowing as you go through in your questions as well. So like you might start with something like the most traditional, especially in ethnographic context, but generally the most common question here is, tell me about your average day. right? So, and they'll say, huh, what do you mean? Well, you come into work, what do you do first? And so you can lead them into this sort of storytelling. And this is a story they know better than anybody else in the world. And so they can kind of go through their day. And then you're going to hit some things along the way where, you'll find, some bells will ring as you're going through this. And so you can revisit this because they've brought it up and say, oh, you said that you log into your computer. So, was that hard to learn? This is a stupid question. Was that hard to learn how to do? Or what's the first thing you do when you get on the computer or something like that, right? So depending on what it is you're trying to investigate, you kind of let them bring the subject up first. And so that gives you that broad sense. And again, it gives you the opportunity, if they go in a direction you didn't expect, to maybe explore something that you didn't know you were going to explore. So you've got this. So step 3 is to identify your interview targets. You probably have something broadly in mind, but you really need to kind of go through a list and have a group of people that you plan to interview. So how many should you interview? And I don't know. Big numbers sound really good, and it sounds like you did a lot of work. But there isn't some standard here. There isn't. You have to interview 20 people. That just doesn't exist, right? You should interview the people you need to interview to get the answers that you need to, and to make sure those answers are somewhat representative. This is not, you're not doing kind of standard statistical sampling here. You're not saying, I have a universe of 80 people in this organization. I need to interview a set of 20 of them or something like that, right? That's not what you're trying for. You want to make sure that you have a representative set, and you want to make sure that you're talking to people where you're going to get multiple answers, and you can start to triangulate between those answers. And you want to have people that are viewing this from different perspectives. This is actually a little tricky here because you're trying to, it's not a convenient sample. In fact, some of the least convenient people to interview are sometimes the best people to talk to. Often people will forget to talk to the excluded people in the group. If you're talking to an organization, talking to someone who got fired can be really, really useful. Yes, they come in with a bias, absolutely. But that can open up, if you have 2 different perspectives, that can really open some things up when you talk to other folks as well. So, someone who wasn't hired or someone who was fired, here again, I'm talking mostly in a business context, but there is something similar in every organization. Someone who was excluded from the organization, or who was not included, someone who was not promoted to a more central role or something like that. Those are the folks that are often the best to talk to because they may not be referenced by the other people as easily, but they will give a different perspective. And that when you go on to other interviews, you can kind of test those against. You don't have to name those people. In fact, that would be a really bad idea. But are there other people who might say X, Y, and Z? You've said A, B, and C, but are there other people in the organization you think might say X, Y, and Z happened instead, right? So that gives you an opportunity to try to break down where there may be contrasts in those views. If one of the ways that people will often do interviewing is in a kind of a snowball sample, which is as people bring up names, again, they won't bring up the name of the person who was fired in most cases, right? But they may bring up other people, and you say, oh well, first thing when I come to the office today is I always talk to Shauna because Shauna's great, and we get. So if you talk to 2 or 3 people and they all say hi to Shauna, you better be interviewing Shauna, right? So this is kind of that snowball process. So one of the ways you can tell if you've interviewed enough people is if you have people like that keep coming up and you haven't talked to them yet, they should be part of the people you're talking to most likely, right? So you have kind of a snowball saturation here where once you've talked to Shauna, and once you start hearing the same names over and over again, and you feel like you've talked to everyone that is part of these sets of interactions, maybe you're done with doing interviews. The other part of saturation is, have you heard the same idea so many times that if you interview one more person, are they just going to say the same things that you've already heard over and over again? Have you hit that level of saturation? Honestly, this feels a little bit like how you do a lit review as well. So, people will say, well, how many sources do I need to do a lit review? And the answer is you need to have enough sources that you've done the lit review. And that is a question of saturation, right? Are there people that are being referenced in the things you're reading that you haven't read yet? You should go read them. So like if, at some point you're going to find 6 people are referencing the same person or the same article, you better have read that article, for example, right? But at some point you're going to call up a new article and they all seem to be referencing these same dozen people, and you start to get a feeling that you've hit saturation on your citations. Same thing with the information. They seem to be saying the same things and you're not getting anything new as you add on new citations. Then you've probably hit saturation on the ideas. You can take the same rough approach to how you decide how many people to interview. Next, you have to decide where you're going to interview these people, and where not to interview them is your lab or your office or something like that. So we can take that one off the plate. What you want to do is interview them somewhere where they're comfortable and where you have some level of privacy. There's some contrast here in terms of what people think the best choice is. Many people prefer in-person interviews because you have much more context. You can build rapport more easily. There's a greater degree of trust. So that traditionally, that has been the kind of ideal view. And that in-person interview, if it happens in the context in which the social interactions you're working with also occur, that can be helpful, right? Because people feel like they're on their home turf. They feel like they have, the places you are in some ways shape the way you think. And so if you're in the place that you're talking about, sometimes that can help people think about that. The disadvantage there is that it may not be their home turf. They may not feel comfortable in the place they're working, and they may not feel, especially if there's people around that may overhear them or something like that, or see the interview or ask them right afterwards about the interview. They may not feel super comfortable about that process, right? So it may be actually a little harder to get that rapport, in which case a coffee shop, a park, there are other options out there where you can meet them in person. I think at this point, a lot of people are doing these interviews over video, right? Over Zoom, over Skype, something like that. And that has some significant advantages as well. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. Roughly speaking, the major advantages here are that it is way easier to coordinate these interviews if you're not driving all over or flying all over to do this, right? It's easier to deal with the timing. It's much more convenient for the respondent and for you. And importantly, most of these have a way of building in recording that's pretty good. I will say, if you are recording these, saying using Zoom's record and or transcription process, it's not a bad idea to record, again, as long as you've got this cleared through your protocol as well, to record on actual tape recorder or on to do some kind of backup recording as well, because there's nothing worse than going through a great interview and realizing that there was some technical flaw in what's being recorded or something like that. So backup recording is always a good idea. Disadvantages here are that it may be a little harder to do that kind of rapport depending on how often they use these technologies. I don't feel as close to someone that I haven't met face to face, even though I prefer to have video conversations. I don't feel as close. I don't have the same kind of trust levels with someone who I haven't yet met face to face. And so that can be one piece of it. One piece of it is you're never entirely sure what's going on around the person. And so, you have that kind of question. And honestly, you don't know if they're going to be interrupted. You don't know if you have their full attention in the same way as when you're in the same room. You don't know if they have if they're watching the game behind the screen or something like that. So it does provide, being co-located physically does provide some advantages. Again, on the whole, when I'm doing interviews, I end up interviewing online, on video now far more often than not. After the pandemic, especially, people got used to that. So the idea of having a meeting online is not that unusual anymore. You don't have to worry quite as much about technical failures when it happens. You need to, the other kind of negative here is if your IRB requires you to have signed paper informed consent forms, those can be a real pain because it's really hard to kind of manage that. Of course, if they'll allow you to do online signing, which most will now, you should be sure to kind of talk about your disclosure at the beginning of your interview and have someone kind of verbally assent to the fact that you're recording them and that they understand how you're going to use these data. But that can be a little bit of a hiccup here if you're having trouble getting those informed consent forms. All right, you have your book, your plan, you have your targets. You've reached out. Well, you're ready to conduct these interviews, and the first step to that is actually reaching out to the people and inviting them to the interview. My strong recommendation, I've been on the receiving end of people doing interviews of academics, and they have their students reach out to do the planning, to kind of do the coordination, and then they do the interview. I think this is bad practice. The coordination is a pain. It takes time to deal with kind of working with people's schedules and figuring all of that out. But it's a matter of developing rapport and respect from the outset, which is if I think that if my people are going to call your people, or more likely my people are going to call you, it suggests that I think that I am more important than you are, to put it very, very bluntly. And so I think as a matter of respect, you take on the role of setting that up. So if you were working as a team, if I were, for example, working with students, grad students, or undergraduate students even, the person who's actually doing the interview should be the one setting it up. So that I think works out much better along the way. Always send a reminder. I need reminders as the respondent, and your respondents do too. It makes everyone a little less anxious. So send a reminder the day before. After you're done, just have a tickler so you remember to send a thank you note. Again, keeping that relationship is really an important piece of this. So you've got it scheduled. You start the interview. You do not launch into your first question. So you start by developing some rapport. This is something that I'm not great with people. So like the small talk piece is not my strength, to be sure. But go pick up a copy of How to Win Friends and Influence People, notice something, chat with them, let them know that you are an actual human before you kind of dive into things. Those few minutes make a huge difference in the kinds of answers you get. And so, put both of you at ease by chatting a little bit to start with. Express genuine appreciation for their time. Tell them how long it's going to take, and thank them ahead of time, right, for giving you their time to chat with you. Explain what it is you're studying. Be right up front about, these are the things I'm trying to figure out, right? Share that objective with the person you're talking to, and at this point, you should again explicitly ask for them to, if it's okay if you record. And make sure you get the yes kind of on. Don't do it before you hit record, and then say, is it okay if I'm recording this? If they say no, then stop. But you want to have that yes on there as kind of just one more indication that people knew you were recording and how you were going to use it. And don't just say, I'm going to record it, but explain what's going to happen with that recording. Are you going to do something to, in some way, delabel or anonymize or de-identify the responses? It's really hard to do on something like video, but you could at least kind of store the files not under their name and not use their name anywhere in the recordings, for example. I don't generally do that, but some people do try to kind of do some level of anonymity or some level of de-identifying pieces of this when they do. But you can talk about kind of that. Who's going to see the recording? Is it just you? Is it just you and some of the people on your team? Name those people. Be very explicit about that. Are you going to delete these recordings after what are you going to do with the recordings, right? So something like, so I'm just recording this because I want to make sure that I understand. No, let me redo that. So I'm just recording this because I want to make sure that I don't miss anything, and I'm going to be taking notes, but this way I can go back and listen to it afterwards. And then I'm going to kind of extract what I think is the most important bits of it. And when I'm done with that, I'll go ahead and delete this entirely so it's gone. In the meantime, I'm going to store it on a secure server, and no one will see it except for me. I'm the only one that will see it. It's kind of a reminder for my own work. And so something like that, so they have a very clear idea in human language about how it is that you're going to use this stuff, right? This isn't just kind of bureaucratic overhead, although there is a piece of that as well. It's, again, just engaging in ethical research practice, and it's bringing your ethos to the process. It's like showing them that you're a professional and you're going to be serious about handling their data, and you're taking their answers seriously and their privacy seriously. And as I said, take notes. So I'm a terrible note taker. Honestly, I really am. But what I will do is I will take my research guide with the questions, because I need to be referring to them to make sure we come back to them a little bit. And I'll make notes in there. And part of the reason for that is, I'll have the recording, so the notes themselves may not seem important. But what I want to do is kind of note when someone says something that I want to follow up on. If they say something important, I don't want to jump in on them and say, can you say a little bit more about that right away? But I will eventually come back and say, now, a few minutes ago, you had noted X, Y, and Z. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you think that was important? Something like that, right? And I have terrible memory, and I want to make sure I'm focusing on what they say. So I'll just do a couple of words to remind me to come back to that. So that's kind of what I'm doing when I'm taking notes. Your whole goal here is to get the respondent talking. If you're talking more than the respondent, that's a serious problem. So once they're done talking, pause for a slightly uncomfortable moment. Give them a chance to kind of, this might be a good time to turn down and just take a couple of notes real quick, but pause. Now, again, you should not be sitting here. You're not a psychiatrist, and you're not a reporter. Eye contact's important, especially in a venue like this where you're talking on a screen. But glancing down and just smiling for a second, and the head tilt, right? Just making sure they understand that you're here and listening to them, and give them a chance to kind of, if they have more to say that, right? Then you can do some things that might elicit more. You can restate what they've said. So I think what you're saying here is blah, 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 blah. Do I have that roughly right? What have I missed? Try to open up the spaces for them to elaborate more. You can actually do a little bit. You have to be very careful about not priming on this, but you can say, oh, you said you talk to Shauna every time. Was it Shauna that we're talking to? I don't remember. But you said you talk to Shauna every morning when you come in. I noticed that Barbara works that job too. Do you have roughly the same kinds of relationships with Shauna and Barbara? You can start to set up some of these places where they might be able to make their own distinctions by priming it. You just have to be really careful about that, because you may have them. Again, as I said before, a lot of people don't have these attitudes until you ask the question. And so they may never have thought about how much they don't like Barbara until you say that. And so, you have to be very sensitive about that. But there are ways you can kind of ask questions that will allow them to open up different corners of this as you go. I will note that there's a piece here, which is I tend to be very effusive. I was in a meeting with one of my colleagues here. It was actually an online meeting. It was a Zoom meeting with a bunch of people. And he noted to me, Alex, did you have something to say there? And I said no. And he said, you have a very effusive eyebrows. Like, if someone says something I don't agree with, I have a tell. And so you need to be very careful here, because your role is to be, attentive and empathetic, but you should also try to be really bland. You want to be small. You want to kind of blend in. because you don't want to fill that space and you don't want to make them feel like they're either judged or like they want to impress you. So really, you need to kind of be small and bland as possible, and, you know, open and receptive, right? But really good interviewers are a fly on the wall, and they can sit there and you feel like you're not there. You wonder for journalistic interviews how people get people to say all this stuff. And it's because they've become the wallpaper. They're just there. They're trustworthy enough to share things with, but they're not judging you. They're there as kind of someone who can take things in rather than judging on the face. Your whole job later is going to be interpreting and judging. But at this stage, you need to be open and avoiding signaling any kind of surprise or disagreement or disapproval or approval. You just kind of need to a nod is always good, an empathetic nod. Yeah. And the final stage is analysis. And I'm not going to talk about analysis right now because at this point, what you need to do is prepare for analysis. And what that means is you need to transcribe your interviews. Almost always. I don't think there's a case, unless you've excluded someone from a group or they've come after you and said, please delete me or remove me from the study. Generally, you're going to be transcribing these things. And honestly, this was the most intensive part of interviewing for the longest time. It takes a long time to properly transcribe an interview. And a lot of people will tell you still need to do this by hand. Put on the headphones, put it on slower speed, and very carefully transcribe everything that someone says, because that gives you the first shot at a deep reading of what they've said. I don't agree with that. I think that that hiring someone to transcribe, which is what you used to have to do, or allowing computers to transcribe, which is what you can do now, makes this process much easier. And so that is what I would do at this point, is allow for the tools for this. It used to be Dragon Naturally Speaking. You'd run it through that. The tools for this now are so much better at capturing nuance, at not messing up the transcriptions. They will still, if you look at any of the subtitles for these videos, you will see they will still mess up quite a bit, especially for neologisms or names or lots of other stuff, but it is 1,000,000% better than it used to be. A little bit of a caveat there. This is true of the video platform you're using, and also then of the transcription platform you're using. You need to make sure that you've done the legwork, or the IRB has done the legwork, to make sure that these are secure platforms, so that you're not, this was true for human transcribers as well, that you're not violating people's privacy by kind of turning it over to an LLM that's then going to use their answers to build other answers for other people or something like that. So you have to be very cognizant about the rules and the guarantees of privacy of the platforms you're using. In the US context, the ones that generally are the best to use are those that guarantee sort of medical privacy, because we have very little in terms of privacy regulation in the United States. But one of the areas we have a little bit more is in terms of medical data. And so, if they're good for medical data, they're probably good for social science data too. But, don't just look for the certification. Actually do the legwork to make sure that you're maintaining the privacy of your respondents and their data. So to summarize, interviews are one of the oldest and most powerful tools in the social sciences to do, especially to do a kind of initial set of exploratory discovery. And when carefully planned and ethically conducted, rigorously analyzed on the back end, they provide insight into how people understand their own worlds, their social worlds, and their places within them. They're not casual conversations. They're carefully crafted encounters between the researcher and the respondent or the participant, designed to produce some kind of new interpretable knowledge. In some of the things that follow here, we're going to take this in different directions. We'll look a little bit about how we're going to analyze the data that we've extracted from these interviews, because once you've transcribed it, it's now basically a text. It's something you can do thematic analysis, content analysis, both traditional and more computer-aided forms of those two. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a coming unit. But we're also going to talk about kind of what this looks like when you bring it into the context of a focus group or a group interview. What it means, and really that's still an interview. We call them focus groups, but it's an interview. It just adds some challenges and maybe some advantages when you're interviewing multiple people at once and when they get to interact a bit as well. We'll talk about surveys, and from my perspective, a survey is a structured interview. So it's kind of taking this process of interviewing people and then moving it into a more formalized structure, whether that's in text or in some other context. So we'll talk about that as well. I just want to close a little bit by looking forward. Anyone who's been on the job market lately knows that some companies are doing video interviews online, but with bots. I suspect that's going to continue forward. I don't know what that means for the researcher. I think that there are maybe ways in which we could use artificial people, to use a term, one term, I guess, where we could kind of artificialize this and do video interviews that really were surveys. How much do we trust the ability? First of all, how much do we trust the ability of an artificial agent to build rapport? Not very much at all. How much do we trust a video agent to, or artificial agent of some sort to extract and dig into the context? I don't know. My gut reaction is not at all. Is again, at least at the current development of LLMs, for example, I wouldn't feel like they would be able to adequately do that without introducing just a huge amount of bias into that process. LLMs right now tend to normalize towards a mean, and that's exactly what we don't want to do when we're interviewing, right? We want to leave that open-ended. And so at least at the current stage of development, I think this would be really bad. What they might be able to do is basically do a structured interview, maybe with some branching and maybe even with some pretty sophisticated branching where you can kind of go into sub areas of some sort. But I remain unsure about how quickly we might be at a place where we could use them in interviewing to a greater degree than that.